April 30th, 1943. A body washes ashore near Huelva, Spain. A British Royal Marine officer, briefcase chained to his wrist, classified documents inside. The Spanish authorities notify the Germans. Hitler himself reviews the intelligence. And just like that, the course of World War II shifts. Except, the man wasn't who they thought he was. The documents, not what they seemed. And the entire thing, well, it was one of the most elaborate cons ever pulled off in wartime history. Before we dive into this, you might want to grab yourself a coffee, maybe settle back into your chair, because what you're about to hear, it's the kind of story that sounds too clever to be real. But it was real, every bit of it. And if you're into these kinds of wartime operations, the brilliant minds, the desperate gambles, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because there's more where this came from. Now let me take you back to 1943. The war, it's been grinding on for years now. Britain, America, the Allies, they're planning something big, something that could change everything. They're going to invade Europe, push back against the Nazis. But there's a problem, a big one. Sicily. That's the target, the island at the bottom of Italy, strategic, vital, the gateway to the soft underbelly of Europe, as Churchill called it. But here's the thing. Everyone knew it. The Germans, they weren't stupid. If you're the Allies and you want to get into Europe from the Mediterranean, where do you go? Sicily. It's obvious. Too obvious. And that meant the Germans would be ready, dug in, fortified. The invasion, it could turn into a bloodbath before it even started. So British intelligence, they had to figure something out. They needed the Germans to look somewhere else, anywhere else, maybe Greece or Sardinia. Get them to move their forces, spread them thin, make Sicily vulnerable. But how do you convince the enemy that your obvious target isn't actually your target? How do you sell that lie? That's where it gets interesting. See, there was this idea floating around in British intelligence circles. It came from something called the 20 Committee, the guys who ran double agents and deception operations. They'd been thinking about this for a while, inspired by something that happened earlier in the war. In 1942, a British plane crashed in Spain, and one of the passengers was a courier carrying sensitive documents. The Germans got their hands on those papers through Spanish intermediaries, even though Spain was technically neutral. That incident, it planted a seed. What if? What if you could do that on purpose? The concept was simple, almost too simple. You take a dead body, you dress it up as a British officer, you give it fake documents suggesting the Allies are planning to invade somewhere other than Sicily, and you let the body wash up where the Germans can get to it. They find it, they read the documents, they believe the lie, they move their troops. Simple. Except, nothing about war is ever simple. First problem, you need a body. Not just any body, a body that could pass as someone who drowned at sea, someone whose death wouldn't raise suspicions. And you can't just, go around killing people for your deception operation. So where do you get one? Enter Ewen Montagu and Charles Cholmondeley, two officers working for British naval intelligence. Montagu was a lawyer before the war, sharp mind, detail-oriented. Cholmondeley, he was RAF, a flight lieutenant, creative thinker. Together, they became the architects of what would be called Operation Mincemeat. They needed a corpse, and they found one. A man named Glyndwr Michael. He was 34 years old, homeless, living rough in London. In January 1943, he ingested rat poison, likely ate some food that had been contaminated. He died on January 26th. Poor man, life had been hard on him, and now his death would serve a purpose he'd never know about. But they couldn't tell anyone the real identity. That had to stay secret. So they gave him a new one. Major William Martin, Royal Marines. They created an entire identity for him, a life, a backstory. Because if the Germans were going to believe this, they needed to believe in the man, not just the documents. This is where it gets detailed, almost obsessive. They didn't just dress him in a uniform and call it done. No, they gave Major Martin a personality. They put letters in his pockets, love letters from a fiancée named Pam. There was a photo of her, too. Actually, a photo of an MI5 clerk who'd agreed to pose for it. There were ticket stubs from a London theater, a receipt from a jeweler for an engagement ring, an overdraft notice from his bank. Little things, human things, the kind of things a real person would carry. They even aged the documents, made them look worn like they'd been in his pockets for a while. They thought of everything, because they knew that if the Germans found this body, they'd be suspicious. They'd check everything. The deception had to be perfect. Now, the documents themselves, that was the heart of it. They created letters, correspondence between high-ranking British officers. One was supposedly from Lieutenant General Archibald Nye, Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, to General Harold Alexander, who commanded Allied forces in North Africa. Casual, chatty even, but with strategic details slipped in. Mentions of an upcoming invasion of Greece, codename Operation Husky. Wait, no, actually, Husky was deliberately kept as the real codename for Sicily. They had to make this convincing. The fake documents suggested operations against Greece and Sardinia instead. There was another letter, too, from Lord Louis Mountbatten, Chief of Combined Operations, to Admiral Andrew Cunningham, the naval commander in the Mediterranean. More mentions of Greece, more details designed to misdirect. They put these documents in a briefcase, chained it to the body's wrist, just like a real courier would have it. Secure, important, the kind of thing that said, "These papers matter." But then came another problem, the body. Glyndwr Michael had been dead for months by the time they were ready to use him. They'd kept him in cold storage, but a body, it deteriorates. They needed the Germans to think he'd drowned recently, that he'd been in the water only a short time. Would the condition of the body match that story? They consulted with a pathologist, Sir Bernard Spilsbury, one of the most famous forensic experts in Britain. He examined the body, gave his opinion. The cause of death, the rat poisoning, it had caused fluid in the lungs that could, maybe, possibly pass for drowning if the Germans didn't look too closely. It was a risk, but wars are made of risks. They put the body in a special canister, packed in dry ice, kept it preserved. Then they loaded it onto a submarine, HMS Seraph. The date was April 19, 1943. The submarine left Scotland, headed south, toward the Spanish coast. The crew didn't know what was in the canister, not at first. Eventually, the captain, Lieutenant Norman Jewell, he was briefed. He knew the mission. Drop the body off the coast of Huelva, make it look like an air crash at sea, let the currents take it to shore. Why Huelva? Because of the tides, the currents. They'd carry the body to the beach. And because Huelva had something else, a German agent, Adolf Klaus. He was a German who'd been living in Spain, working as a spy, passing information back to Berlin. The British knew about him. They were counting on him. On April 30th, just before dawn, HMS Seraph surfaced about a mile off the Spanish coast. They brought the canister up, opened it, the body dressed in full uniform, the briefcase attached. They checked everything one last time. The letters, the personal effects, the uniform, all there. They read a passage from the Bible, Psalm 39. Lord, let me know mine end, and the number of my days, that I may be certified how long I have to live. A burial at sea. Then they slipped the body into the water, let it go. The submarine dove, disappeared back into the depths. The body drifted. The tides, just as predicted, carried it to shore. A Spanish fisherman found it later that morning, called the authorities. The local officials, they contacted the British vice consul in Huelva, as they were supposed to. Neutral country, dead British officer, proper protocols. But they also did something else. They contacted the Germans, or rather the Spanish Navy, which had, let's say, close ties with German intelligence. They made sure the information got where it needed to go. Here's the thing about Spain in 1943. Officially neutral, but Franco's government, it leaned toward the Axis. Not openly, but enough. Enough that German agents operated pretty freely there. Enough that when something like this happened, the Germans heard about it. Adolf Klaus, he got word of the body. He wanted those documents. The Spanish military, they recovered the briefcase, and here's where it gets delicate. They had to open it, photograph the contents, get them to the Germans, and then reseal it so the British wouldn't know it had been compromised. The Spanish did exactly that. They carefully opened the briefcase, removed the letters, photographed every page. Then they passed the photographs to Klaus, who sent them on to Madrid, and from there to Berlin. The originals were put back, the briefcase resealed. When the British vice consul finally got the body and the briefcase back on May 13th, they examined the seals. They could tell they'd been tampered with, which was perfect. That's exactly what they wanted. Now, in London, Montagu and the others, they waited. They had no way of knowing if it worked. They'd done everything right, set the trap perfectly. But would the Germans take the bait? The answer came in the form of intercepted messages. Ultra. The British code-breaking operation at Bletchley Park, they'd cracked the German Enigma codes, could read their communications. And what they read? It was better than they'd hoped. The documents reached Hitler himself. He reviewed them personally, and he believed them. Not just believed, he acted on them. He ordered reinforcements sent to Greece. He moved troops away from Sicily. The German Navy positioned U-boats around Greece, waiting for the Allied invasion that would never come. Field Marshal Ewen Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, he was sent to Greece to oversee the defenses there. Whole divisions redirected. The Germans even reinforced Sardinia and Corsica, other locations mentioned in the fake documents. It worked. The deception worked. When the Allies launched Operation Husky, the real invasion of Sicily, on July 9, 1943, they faced lighter resistance than expected. Not that it was easy. War is never easy. But the Germans had been spread thin, their forces divided, expecting attacks elsewhere. The invasion succeeded. Sicily fell. And from there, the Allies pushed into Italy. How many lives did Operation Mincemeat save? Impossible to know. Hundreds? Thousands? But the invasion could have been a disaster, and instead, it was a success. After the war, the story came out. In 1950, Montagu wrote about it, The Man Who Never Was. It became famous. They even made it into a movie in 1956. But some details remained classified for years. The identity of the body, for instance. For a long time, they said it was a sailor who died at sea, no name given. It wasn't until 1996 that researchers finally identified Glyndwr Michael as the man behind Major William Martin. Even then, some records stayed sealed until the early 2000s. And there were questions, debates among historians. Did the Germans really believe it completely? Some argue that German intelligence had doubts, that some officers suspected deception. There were reports that the Abwehr, German military intelligence, they questioned the authenticity. Too convenient, too perfect. But here's what matters. Hitler believed it. The high command believed it, and they acted on it. Whether they were doubts lower down, whether some German officers were skeptical, it didn't change the outcome. The troops moved, the defenses shifted, and Sicily was left more vulnerable than it should have been. There's something almost artistic about it. The level of detail, the thought that went into every aspect. This wasn't just lying to the enemy. This was constructing an entire alternate reality, making them believe in a person who never existed, in plans that were never real. It was theater, performed for an audience of enemy intelligence officers. And the British, they learned from it. Operation Mincemeat wasn't the only deception operation of the war, but it was one of the most successful. It proved that with enough careful planning, enough attention to detail, you could manipulate enemy strategy on a massive scale. Think about the layers involved. You had to understand how the enemy thinks, what they'd find credible. You had to know the practical details, how a body in water behaves, how documents age, what a British officer would actually carry in his pockets. You had to anticipate their suspicions and plan around them. And then you had to trust that when the moment came, when the body was found, that all these pieces would come together the way you intended. It could have failed at any point. The body could have been too decomposed. The Spanish could have been more cooperative with the British than expected. The Germans could have seen through the deception. The documents could have been dismissed as a clumsy plant. Any of those things happens and the operation fails. Worse, it could have backfired, made the Germans even more certain Sicily was the target. But it didn't. Every piece fell into place. There's a memorial now to Glyndwr Michael in Huelva at the cemetery where the body was buried. It says William Martin on the gravestone, but there's a plaque nearby explaining the truth. A homeless man from London who died alone, who became a hero of World War II without ever knowing it. There's something poignant about that. Tragic, even. His life, from what we little know, was difficult. Poverty, hardship, no family to speak of. And then, in death, he served a purpose. Saved lives, changed history. Would he have chosen it if he'd known it? We can't know. But the men who made that choice, Montagu and Cholmondeley and the others, they must have thought about that. Using a man's body without his consent, even for a good cause. It's not a comfortable thing. But war doesn't allow for comfortable choices. The ethics of deception operations, they're complex. You're not just lying, you're manipulating human beings, exploiting their beliefs and assumptions. In war, we accept that. We call it strategy, tactics. But it's still manipulation, still using people, even if those people are your enemies. Operation Mincemeat, it showed how far that manipulation could go. Creating a fictional person, giving him a life story, emotions, relationships, making the enemy care about whether this fake person had been engaged, whether he'd paid his bills. It's psychological warfare at its most sophisticated. And the Germans, they had their own deception operations. This wasn't one-sided. Intelligence work during World War II was this constant dance of lies and counter-lies, each side trying to outguess the other. The double-cross system, where the British turned German spies and fed false information back to Berlin. The Germans owned fake military units, inflatable tanks and dummy aircraft meant to fool Allied reconnaissance. But Operation Mincemeat stands out because of its audacity, because it worked so well, and because it was so human. Not high-tech, not complicated machinery, just a body, some papers, and an understanding of how people think. After the war, intelligence services around the world studied it. What made it succeed? How could the technique be replicated? The details mattered, yes, but there was something else. Timing, context. The Germans were primed to believe in an invasion of Greece because strategically it made sense. The documents confirmed what they already suspected might be true. That's the key to any good deception. You don't make the enemy believe something completely contradictory to their understanding. You reinforce a belief they already half hold. Montagu and Cholmondeley, they understood that. They weren't trying to convince the Germans that the Allies would never attack anywhere. They were just redirecting the focus, shifting it from the real target to a plausible alternative. Greece was believable. The Eastern Mediterranean, the Balkans, Hitler had interests there. It wasn't absurd. That's why it worked when other deception attempts during the war failed. Credibility. Every detail supported the larger lie. The personal effects on the body, for instance, the love letters from Pam. One of them mentioned a night at the Cabaret Club in London. The receipt from the jeweler, it was dated just days before the supposed death. The overdraft notice, it showed a man living beyond his means, which fit the profile of a young officer trying to impress his fiancée. These weren't just random items, they told a story. They made Major William Martin feel real. And the Germans, when they analyzed the documents, they looked at all of it, not just the official letters, but the personal items too, because those personal items, they were what made the official letters credible. Why would someone fake love letters? Why would they create a whole fictional fiancé? It seemed like too much effort for a deception, so it must be real. That's the genius of it. The level of detail was so excessive, so thorough, that it became its own form of authentication. There's a story, maybe apocryphal, that when Montagu was planning the operation, he had dinner with his brother, Ivor Montagu, who was a filmmaker. They were discussing how to make the deception believable. And Ivor said something like, "If you want someone to believe a lie, give them a truth they can verify." The personal effects, those were the verifiable truths. The Germans could check if the Cabaret Club existed, if there was a jeweler at that address in London. And when those details checked out, the bigger lie became easier to swallow. Intelligence work, at its core, it's about understanding human nature, what people believe, why they believe it, how to manipulate those beliefs. Operation Mincemeat was a masterclass in that. It wasn't about fooling machines or cracking codes. It was about fooling people. And people, we're predictable in certain ways. We look for patterns. We trust details that confirm what we already think. We believe stories that feel emotionally true. Major William Martin felt emotionally true. A young officer, in love, careless enough to be carrying sensitive documents, unlucky enough to die in a plane crash at sea. It's tragic, but it's a kind of tragedy that happens in war. The Germans had probably heard similar stories from their own forces, so why wouldn't they believe this one? And there's another layer to consider. The British knew the Germans would be suspicious, so they built in things that would satisfy that suspicion. The body's condition, it wasn't perfect. If the Germans examined it closely, they might have questions, but the British had answers ready. The pathology report from the Spanish doctor said drowning. And if the Germans doubted that, well, bodies in water, they deteriorate in unpredictable ways. Who could say for certain? The documents themselves, the letters, they weren't too obvious. They didn't say, "We are invading Greece on this date with this many troops." That would have been immediately suspicious. Instead, they were oblique, conversational, the way real military correspondence often is. "We're giving serious thought to the Balkans," that kind of language. It required interpretation. And when people have to interpret something, when they have to fill in the gaps themselves, they're more likely to believe the conclusion they reach. It's like, if I tell you outright that something is true, you might question it. But if I give you pieces of information and you put them together yourself and decide it's true, you'll believe it much more strongly, because now it's your conclusion, not mine. That's what the letters did. They gave the Germans pieces, let them assemble the picture. And the picture they assembled said Greece. In the months after Sicily fell, as the Italian campaign dragged on, the Germans must have realized they'd been deceived. At some point, someone in Berlin put it together. The documents were fake, the body was a plant, but by then it was too late. The damage was done. And here's the thing, they couldn't even be entirely sure. Maybe the Allies had planned to invade Greece, but then changed their minds at the last minute. Maybe the documents were real, and the invasion of Sicily was a contingency plan that got activated instead. Intelligence work is full of uncertainty. You never have perfect information. The Germans had to make decisions based on what they thought they knew, and Operation Mincemeat made them think they knew something they didn't. After the war, when the story became public, there was apparently some embarrassment in German military circles. How had they been fooled so completely? Some officers tried to claim they'd suspected all along that the operation hadn't really influenced their decisions. But the records show otherwise. The troop movements were real. The reinforcements to Greece were real. The vulnerability of Sicily was real. In intelligence histories, Operation Mincemeat is held up as one of the most successful deception operations ever conducted. It's taught in military academies, studied by intelligence officers. What can we learn from this? How do you create a believable cover story? How do you anticipate enemy analysis? How do you manage operational security when so many people are involved? Because it wasn't just Montagu and Cholmondeley. There were dozens of people who knew about the operation: the submarine crew, the pathologist, the people who created the fake documents and personal effects, the intelligence officers who analyzed the German responses. Any of them could have talked, could have let something slip, but they didn't. Operational security held. That's its own kind of achievement. In the decades since, there have been other deception operations, some successful, some not. During the Cold War, both sides engaged in disinformation campaigns, fake defectors, planted documents, but few had the elegance of Operation Mincemeat. Maybe because modern intelligence relies so much on technology now. Satellites, signals intelligence, cyber operations. There's less room for the human touch, for that kind of creative storytelling. But the principles remain. Understand your enemy, give them information that confirms their biases, make the lie detailed enough to be believable, and trust that human nature, the tendency to see what we expect to see, will do the rest. Glyndwr Michael's body, after the war, stayed buried in Huelva. The Spanish authorities knew the truth by then, but the gravestone still said William Martin. It wasn't until 1996 that researchers definitively proved his real identity. They tracked down records from the coroner's office in London, matched the timing, put the pieces together. His family, what little family he had, they'd never known what happened to him. He died alone, was buried in an unmarked grave in London, or so they thought. Turns out he'd traveled farther in death than he ever had in life. From London to Scotland to the coast of Spain, and in the process, helped change the course of the war. There is a question that comes up sometimes in discussions of Operation Mincemeat. Was it ethical? Taking a dead man's body, using it without permission, creating a false identity for him. In the context of war, the answer is usually yes. The ends justified the means. Lives were saved. The operation contributed to Allied victory. What's one body compared to that? But it's still worth thinking about, because intelligence operations, they often involve using people, sometimes with their knowledge and consent, like the double agents in the double-cross system, sometimes without, like Glyndwr Michael. And we accept it because it's war, because the stakes are existential. But it's still a use of human beings as tools. Montagu, in his later writings, he acknowledged this. He never quite said he regretted it, but he understood the ethical complexity. He'd made a choice in wartime that served a larger purpose, and he lived with that choice. The operation's success overshadowed those concerns. When people tell the story of Operation Mincemeat, they focus on the cleverness, the audacity, the way it fooled the Germans. And that's fair. It was clever. It was audacious. But it's also a story about a homeless man named Glyndwr Michael, who died in pain from rat poison, and whose body was used to save lives he'd never know about. Both things are true. Both are part of the story. In 2021, there was a new film made about Operation Mincemeat, with Colin Firth playing Montagu. It renewed interest in the operation, brought it to a new generation. People were fascinated all over again by the ingenuity of it, the details, the way it worked. And those details, they matter. Not just for understanding this specific operation, but for understanding how deception works, how intelligence works, how war works. Because modern conflicts, they still involve deception. Different methods maybe, but the same principles. Make the enemy believe something false, get them to act on it, gain an advantage. Operation Mincemeat did that as well as it's ever been done. A dead body, fake documents, and a carefully constructed lie. And with that, they shifted the balance of a campaign, saved countless lives, brought the end of the war a little bit closer. Ewen Montagu died in 1985. Charles Cholmondeley died in 1999. Both lived long lives after the war. Both carried the knowledge of what they'd done. Did they talk about it often? Did they think about the body in the water, drifting toward shore, carrying their deception with it? Probably. How could they not? It was the thing they'd be remembered for. The man who never was. The operation that fooled Hitler himself. And somewhere in Spain, in a cemetery in Huelva, there's a grave. It says William Martin on the stone. But now, thanks to historians and researchers, we know the truth. Glyndwr Michael lies there, a man who in death became someone he never was in life, a hero, a key figure in one of World War II's most remarkable stories. That's Operation Mincemeat, a deception so carefully planned, so thoroughly executed that it changed history. All it took was imagination, attention to detail, and the understanding that people, even trained intelligence officers, will believe what they want to believe if you give them the right reasons. War is full of these moments. Decisions made in secret, operations carried out in shadow that shape the outcome of battles and campaigns. Most of them stay classified, hidden in archives. But sometimes, years later, the files are opened, the stories come out, and we get to see just how complex, how human, how strange the reality of war actually is.